Wednesday, December 23, 1991. Honey, I'm home. Jake yelled from downstairs. His yelling woke the two of us up. Ashton rolled over slowly, her hand resting on my chest. Maybe if we don't respond, they'll go away, Ashton said, reluctant to get out of bed. After a few minutes, I got up and put a record on the player before lighting 2 cigarettes. Ashton slowly walked over to me, wiping her tired eyes. She wrapped her arms around my body and pressed her head against my chest. "What are we going to tell them, my love?" she said softly with her finger gliding up my back. "Should we say anything to them at all?" I responded. "I think it will start to take a deeper toll if we don't tell them. Everything that has happened this winter is beginning to get heavy. I think talking to our friends about Jacob and what's been happening will be beneficial to our mental health," she said, looking up at me. She took a drag of her cigarette before placing her head back on my chest. "When we have the moment to bring it up, we will, okay?" I agree. Keeping them in the dark about everything is only going to eat away at us. In a way, they are involved with all of this too. I would want to know if I were them. "When the time comes, we will open up the conversation," I said, kissing the top of her head. "Forrest? I've been thinking about what Blanca said and it's not sitting right with me. She told us that Jacob's father, Mr. Bringston, got the attention of something that resides with the below. She also said that the entity that found Mr. Bringston is most likely the first great king. So the first great king damned Jacob's father, but when Mr. Bringston took his own life, the debt got passed down to Jacob because Jacob is the firstborn male in the family. So the first great king stayed with Jacob the entire time he was at Willow Creek," Ashton stated while taking another drag of her grit. "I see what you're saying, and it makes total sense. So while Jacob stayed at Willow Creek, the first great king accompanied him. That was probably when he started witnessing the cruel acts of Bishop Turner," I said as calmly as I could. "So after the first great king damned the bishop to the below, he went back to Jacob, but according to Blanca, Jacob took his life in his room before the king could get back to him. This means that the debt has still gone unpaid. This means the first great king is still seeking someone or something if he is still with Jacob. Forrest, if Jacob is in our home, it also means the great king might be too," Ashton said with a hint of concern. Right as I began to reply, tapping could be heard from the mirror. We both looked over to see no one, but every few seconds, the tapping would start again before stopping abruptly. After we got dressed, we went downstairs to meet up with the others. "How did you get in?" "We boarded the doggy door last night," Ashton asked sternly. "The sliding door was unlocked this time. We got lucky," Jake replied with a big smile. "That's impossible. I checked it before we went to bed," Ashton responded. "How long have you been here?" I asked, walking over to the kitchen to grab a couple of coffee mugs. "A couple of hours," Jake replied. "What time is it?" 11:13 p.m., Ed replied from the couch. "We washed your couch cushion, by the way." "You're welcome. Looks like someone had a bloody nose," Jake said, taking a sip of coffee. "Fuck. I forgot they didn't anything about what happened yesterday. I haven't told them." "Good guess. We were wrestling and I got him with my elbow," she said, walking up to me in the kitchen. "I'm sorry, baby. Do you forgive me yet?" Ashton said playfully before taking my mug to refill it. "Fuck man, she got you. You bled a lot," Jake responded as he threw a tennis ball across the room for Grim. "Yeah man, it fucking sucked," I replied as we all laughed a little. "Yes, I forgive you, dear," I added, looking over at Ashton. "We are supposed to go back to Blanca's house tonight," Jake said with a bit of excitement. "Perfect," Ashton said with a smile as she got up to grab a notebook and a pen. "We are going to write down every question we have for her. I don't want us to skip out on anything this time. I know we have been holding back," Ashton said as she began writing. "I think I'm holding back questions because she's busy explaining," Jake said, sounding slightly offended. "Or you're holding back because you're a pussy," Ashton responded as she held back a smile, still looking down at the page. "Let's ask her the real stuff this time, no more dancing around it," Kendall said, trying not to laugh at Ashton's comment. We sat for an hour and wrote down every question we could think of. Ashton had a separate page for the ones she wanted to ask her. We have to stay optimistic. I went back and looked into the books she gave us, and I've spent the last couple of nights researching shit. I want you all to see something. Ed then opened one of the books. Lavada of Null. Meaning Land of the Null. This is what Blanca was referring to when she said the below has more than just the inferno. She said that it is a place where the dead have no legal or binding force to anything. So according to what I read about Avnul, the spirits or entities that we know reside here with the living, but Avnul is a part of the below and mirrors us. The dead that resides in the null have absolute freedom until the end of time and are entitled to respect and solitude. This place has been described as a layer of the inferno that is left unwritten, or a sacred place of the unfortunate and deserving. The Halvians or Demonas that Blanca talks about walk amongst the dead with ease and love at Avnul. We can put that down as something to talk with her about, Ed said. So Blanca mentioned a chain of command. What is that about? Kendall asked. Ed reached across the table and grabbed a few books. One called Dictionnaire Infernal, and another named Pseudomonarchia Daemonum. He then opened them to pages he left his bookmarks in. Now this is all confusing as fuck, so I am not going to get too far into it, but it is like what Blanca was saying. There are many depictions of the Inferno along with how it is structured, but for the most part, I read that they followed noble names such as Duke, Earl, Knights, and so on. The Emperor being the highest in command, followed by great kings and kings, then great princes and princes. Now many other books say the hierarchy is different and there are instead 4 emperors. One for the north, one for the east, one for the south, and one for the west. My point is that there are multiple things we don't know, so I can't tell you exactly how everything works. So maybe we can bring that up with Blanca as well. Ed then grabbed Blanca's journal from his backpack and began going through the pages until he landed on a page filled with dates. Every page for the next 27 pages had detailed drawings of what I assume to be the ones Blanca says to walk the forest. I only want to look at a few of these before we go to Blanca's house, Jake said before flipping the page. It was a sketch of a creature. The top of the page read, Malphus, a president of the below. Malphus leads or has governance over 40 legions of Demonas. He may manifest as a tall lanky man or a human-sized raven. His voice is deep and raspy in either form. He was the 14th to be called upon by the Kilpoko. We skipped a few pages and landed on a figure called a Furfur. The Furfur has the body and face of what looked like a giant deer. It has very long antlers with 12 large points. The Furfur has the torso of a human man with very dark elongated human arms. It has large thick, bat-like wings and looked like it was flying through the trees. The Furfur is a duke of the below or hell. He has a rough voice that projects for a mile and could be heard in frequencies audible to the mountain and woodland animals. He is difficult to speak with. You must confine him before he will speak. The next page read, Tap. TAP. This page had many dates and notes. On the side of the drawing, we could see notes that were in another language. She had drawn a figure that I can only relate to as a colossal-sized gargoyle or early-century golem. The ones you would see on the ends of buildings. The figure has elongated arms and legs with extremely hands and feet and fingers. His wings are twice the size of his body and come to sharp points. He has a long furry tail and a large golem-like face. His ears are the size of his head. He is in the company of a man with parted hair who straddles the neck behind the creature's head. The man holds on the horns of the winged figure. He wears clothes from an early medieval era. Underneath the figure was a description that read, Tap was once in heavenly order of powers. A powerful and noble position. He is now a high prince of the below who commands 66 military units. In addition to being one of the highest-ranking rulers within the below, he is ultimately the commander and advisor to 4 of the many kings within hell. Ed took a string from his pocket and placed it between the pages, almost acting like a bookmark. He took a sip of his whiskey and began to explain. From what I understand, this is important. Tap was the second to be called upon by the Kilpoko. Not only is he ruler of 4 kings, but he also plays the role of a messenger between that king and the emperor. So if a king was called upon by the Kilpoko, that means that a king from the below is within the Northridge Forest. If Tap is visiting the mountain, he must be coming to speak with the king. Tap ranks higher than anything in this journal and Blanca drew him. Now, it gets a little more strange. The last date she wrote down was on the 21st of December, 1991. Remember that the 21st of December is the winter solstice. Winter solstice was 2 days ago. This journal was in my possession. The next page was labeled Baalpeor. It looked like a human with troll-like features. He had a long nose with pointed ears, his beard came to a point. It had horns on the top of its head along with the tail that had fur at the tip. His feet looked abnormally large. His toes were long and hairy. The comical thing about Baal Peor is that he is sitting on what appears to be an early century toilet that has wheels attached to the bottom. Blanca had drawn him holding his tail moving a bowl. Baal Peor is a lord of the below and is associated with the deadly sin of sloth. He is known to have a very strange and humorous way of receiving offerings from his worshippers. As comical as it may be, those that worship Baal Peor give their offerings while taking their daily rest on the toilet. The next page read, Garuda. She had drawn a large black bird that resembled a crow or sparrow with the face of a very handsome man. Its body large enough to acquire a bronze saddle that appeared too large for any human to ride. There were many legs to this bird, I counted at least 4 which had many large talons or webbed feet. Garuda was the 5th daemon to be called upon by the Kilpoko. He has no known rank in the hierarchy and holds no obligation to anyone but himself or his purpose. The next page was another drawing labeled, Diamanicus had a page full of literature that did not appear to be in English until the very end. It read, do not follow, do not entertain, do not answer questions, if he wants you, he will find you. I grabbed the journal from Kendall before she got up to go to the bathroom. Ashton and I skipped through the journal while I tried to answer Jake's questions. We skimmed through the journal until we saw a page labeled Jacob. She drew a little boy walking in the woods with a very tall figure walking behind him. She drew the figure as a silhouette in a large robe. Underneath she wrote, Jacob. A young boy. Dead since 1973. A resident of Willow Creek. Is the son of the Bringstons and is in the company of the first great king. Ashton squeezed my hand as we both stared at the page in silence. The first great king of hell was the very first daemon to be called upon by the Kilpoko. He is the most powerful of all kings as well as the most devious and mischievous. The first great king, as well as the emperor, have a direct relationship to the sun and those who worship its greatness. His name must never be spoken about or allowed with others. Once entertained, he will stop at nothing to acquire immense terror and torment. The first great king is capable of having the most horrid and wicked intentions to those deserving of his horror, but he also holds great wisdom and can take the course of someone's soul into the desired direction. The great king is the one who brought Bishop Turner to his death on December 21, 1973. He is responsible for bringing Mr. Bringston to his death, June 21, 1973. He is also responsible for bringing Jacob to his death, December 21, 1973. He is the commander of 66 military units and manifests wearing 3 heads. One being a frog, one being a cat, and one being that of a man with a large crown on top of his head. His body does not resemble any animal. The heads are connected to at least a dozen torsos belonging to female humans. The torsos were separated at the shoulders and are connected to the base of the 3 necks by contorted flesh and tendons. The head of the man along with the cat and from look abnormally large with an incredibly eerie and apathetic glare. The great king can manipulate anyone who crosses his path and is one of the many masters of deception that walked the forest. The last date that had been written down was December 21, 1991. Next to her last note she wrote down the date December 25 and circled it. Ashton handed the journal back over to Ed as Kendall sat back down at the table. Ed took another swig and started again. I want us to take a step back real quick, okay? We cannot just assume this is a thing because Blanca drew them. No matter what, we have to be open to the concept that this could all be complete bullshit. This all hypothetical and again could be complete bullshit, but that is what she wanted us to read so we could all be on the same page as her, he said, petting Grim. I agree, it all seems like some crazy mythology or a dark fairy tale, but what if? What if she is not full of shit? We can't rule it out because the concept sounds crazy. A lot of shit sounds crazy until it is proven to be true, I added. We need to be careful though. We don't know what we are talking to. We don't know what could follow us home. Ed said while turning the pages of Blanca's journal. I think we are okay to go back, we just have to take it easy, Ashton replied. Are we forgetting what we saw on our way out last time, are forgetting the people we saw dancing and singing in the cafeteria? I don't know, I see what you're saying about our research, and it is just as important to me as it is you, but we have to stop at some point before we go too far, Kendall said holding Jake's hand. How about at the turn of the new year, we will stop going to Willow Creek, we can all promise each other that, right? Ed said to all of us. Yeah, we can do that, I said as Ashton laid her head on my shoulder. I promise, we'll stop at New Year, Jake said with his hand up like he was being sworn into court. Cool, we got a deal, Until the new year, Kendall said, taking a huge breath. We sat and talked for a few hours before watching a movie. It wasn't long before we began taking shots of whiskey. Kendall brought a bottle of red wine for her and Ashton. We put on Scooby-Doo for some added irony as we got ready to go to Blanca's. I called her before we left to make sure it was okay. The road was wet but luckily not blanketed in snow or ice. The wind was light but kept the low clouds rolling through the hills. We were excited after our little talk. The energy was pretty high. Ashton wrapped her hands around my arm as we sat in the back next to Ed. "I love you, Forrest," she said, softly kissing me again. "I love you too, my dear," I replied, looking over at her. I looked back out the window. It was a beautiful night. It felt good. Blanca was sitting in her chair on the porch. After giving us our hugs and kisses, we followed her inside to her living room. Our glasses had already been poured. A cigarette was placed on the individual seats. "Hello, my Tanya. How are we this evening?" Blanca said with a large smile. "Good," we all said one by one. "I want to talk to you about the literature you gave me." "I have some questions," Ed said, removing the books from his backpack. "I have answers, my friends, waste no time," she said, taking them back from Ed. "Your drawings? Where are they from?" Ed asked, taking a drag of his cigarette. "I have stumbled across these entities in the forest, my dear." "So those dates, I'm assuming, are dates you've been in their company?" I asked, taking a sip of the horrible wine. "Yes, Forrest," she responded. "I want to talk about the bishop again. I want to get this: his younger years. The bishop was a noble man. One with the best intentions for his community, and had a strong devotion to his faith. Then a banished soul from the above found him and started communicating with him. The banished spirit then filled his head with horrid intentions. The bishop believed that whom he was speaking with was God, and what he was guided to do was a direct request from God, so he did what he could to fulfill his commands. The things he was doing got the attention of the below. So something important from the below sent the banished spirit that influenced the bishop to pay his dues in hell for the rest of eternity. After his communication ended with his spirit, the bishop felt like God had abandoned him. His demeanor changed drastically. He got weak, he became vulnerable. It is my opinion that something from the below had found Bishop Turner. I do not think his company was there to cause more terror to the children, but instead to bring the bishop to the below." "You are a smart young man, Edward," Blanca said, taking another drag of her cigarette. "What happened to Bishop Turner? How did he die?" I asked. "He left his door open one night. Late that night, they found him. The students on the ward tied his hands and feet together and dragged him to the main hall. They took turns hitting him with objects in the room. They beat him until he was unrecognizable. The bigger children broke everyone in that man's body. They ate most of his body, played with the corpse until the sun came up. Some of the children removed the head from the torso and buried it behind the cafeteria deep in the snow. The idea was so the head would never rot or succumb to the weather. The following night the first suicide took place in Building 3. He was a young boy. His name is Jacob. It is believed that the entity that accompanied Bishop Turner had found the little boy and brought him to take his life in his room at Willow Creek. The hairs on my back stood up. I began to feel a hand entwine with mine and squeeze. Blanca then looked to the side of me and smiled. She then continued. "After that, it was a matter of time before the state got a hold of the situation and closed Willow Creek in 1973. Every student on the ward died within 3 years of the institution's closing." "Where are the bodies?" Ashton said, taking a sip of her wine. "I'm going to tell you what I've been told. I do not know this for a fact because I haven't been there. Some of the bodies are buried behind Building 2. Those are the unmarked graves. The rest have been moved and buried far underground, just a few miles east from Willow Creek. The tunnels in which they were brought to is the same place the Kilpoco brought their dead and the same place the villagers buried their dead. The Kilpoco believed in burying the deceased as far underground as they could to keep them from the bad spirits in the forest. So they created an intricate system of tunnels to confuse the negative entities as well as properly bury the deceased and keep them safe. This tradition has been passed down from the natives until the present day. Descendants and ancestors of this land won't be found at a cemetery in the Northridge Forest. They will be brought to the area quarters I am speaking of to be buried far underground with the others. I knew one person that went to the quarters and I have not seen them since. There are many rumors about those tunnels, but if you ask me, it almost sounds like an accidental offering according to those books you read. See, the above lies 61,452 feet elevation, blending in with the clouds. That means that the below lies 61,452 feet underground. That is to the number, exactly how deep those tunnels ran underground. Do you understand what I am telling you, Edward? Blanca said with a small grin. Yes, ma'am, I read about offerings in those books, Ed said with a smile. Ashton reached into her pocket and brought out a folded piece of paper. How do we find the entrance to the quarters? Jake asked with a bit of excitement. You have to be escorted there, my dear. If you look for it, you won't ever find it, but if you are escorted to the entrance alive, you will find yourself with the wicked. You must be careful. I will have you know, it is in your best interest to not enter these quarters. I have some questions about the wicked. I hope you don't mind, but we were looking in your journal. I was wondering if you could tell us more about them. Ashton said, handing Blanca the list of names. Blanca read the list for a few moments before pouring herself more wine. The wicked, the entities, are not to be sought out and are not to be questioned. If you ever take the time to look into religions and practices, you will find that these entities are unmerciful, wicked, and deceptive. Some of them are hostile, my friends, some of them are harmless. Some want to do nothing to make others suffer, while others have a very different purpose. Some are legion commanders, some are messengers, some are executioners, some are sent to take one's soul for the things they have done. Many will torment the living for no reason other than pleasure. You stay away from them. If you have the slightest idea that you are in the presence of the wicked, you must not entertain. Blanca said, putting 3 books back on the shelves. She held on to the journal. What are the symbols? I asked. Which ones, my dear? There are so many, she responded before sitting down near trees. To start, I asked. Those, my Tanya, are for protection. My great-grandfather taught my mother, and my mother taught me how to live in the forest and the importance of not becoming a bother to the forest. It takes many years to establish your place in the trees. I have come across spirits with the worst intentions. The rituals and practices I do, are to keep them out of my home, to keep me safe. Makes sense, Ed said, lighting his cigarette. What about the ones inside of Willow Creek? Ashton said, taking back her notepad from Blanca. The majority of what you feel inside of Willow Creek are simply the dead. The ones who lived their life at some point in time, but when they passed away, their spirit was not taken to the above or the below. They simply are lost and roam the halls of the buildings they died in. Some of the entities are from the above and been cast down for one reason or another. Their intentions are unclear, but for the most part, they do their best to influence the living to have horrid intentions for the love and respect of God. The wicked entities that you might find the most troubling belong to the below and have been here since the Kilpoco called upon them many years ago. They were never alive at all. The crosses above the doorways, the portraits on the walls, and the religious symbols you find all belong to a mixture of Catholicism, Christianity, as well as some others. Why? Why have so many mixed signals? Jake asked. The banished human spirit from the above, the one talking in Turner's ear, is the one to blame for this, Blanca responded. Ashton squeezed my hand again. It made me realize something. Blanca hasn't been in the institution and told us no one has gone inside since it closed. How does she know what's on the walls? Is everything okay, Forrest? Blanca said, looking over with a little concern. Your energy changed abruptly, she added. I'm okay, just thinking a lot. It just makes sense, I replied as I took a drag of my cigarette. Look, as long as none of you try communicating with them, you should be okay. You never know whom you're talking to, she said, taking a sip from her glass. Fuck. We have definitely done that. She continued, and if you do, never offer help to the ones that you're speaking to, no matter how much you want to. This is giving spirits the green light to follow you until you fulfill your promise. Fuck. We have all offered help as well. Now listen closely, I will repeat this if you need me to, Blanca said, looking over at Ashton then at me. Sometimes you decide your fate with your own beliefs and actions, but sometimes you have no choice. Sometimes they find you, to pay the debts that have been passed down through the family. I'm going to tell you one time and one time only, my Tanya, do not go back to Willow Creek. I beg of you, please do not do it, she said with a bit of concern. What if we did? Ashton said, leaning forward. You wouldn't be able to take back your entertainment, she said, taking another drag. Take your pictures if you wish not to stay away. My friends, you will soon understand why the photos dance. These are not ghosts, these are not urban legions. There is not much that can bring you out once you are in the company of the below. This is not like the movies, this is nothing like the stories you read. The below, the wicked are as raw and unmerciful as it gets. You say you do this for research. I say you should do your research elsewhere. There are simply some places you should have never seen, there are words you should never hear. There are trails you should have never walked down, and there are people you never should have met. You do not need to go back to Willow Creek. You do not need to seek the quarters nor what resides inside. After tonight, I don't think we are, said Kendall with a straight face. We talked with her for a little while longer before walking us out. Blanca hugged Jake, Kendall and Ed and wished them a good night. She once again made her way over to Ashton and I last. We stood on the porch while the others walked through the heavy snow and over to the Jeep. Blanca then faced us. Tomorrow, you must come back here, I would like to talk to just the two of you, without the others, she said with a stern look. My friend, Forrest, you bring heavy shoulders tonight, along with two heavy hands, she said looking over at me. We will be here, I responded as she hugged and kissed Ashton's cheek. We walked through the heavy winds and snow until we reached Jake's Jeep. Jake dropped us off at my house before making his way back to his house where Ed's car was. We fed Grim then made our way up into the bedroom. We watched the news as I held her under the covers. After a couple of moments, Ashton pulled off and faced me, laying on her stomach. I love you, Forrest, she said as she looked up at me with a smile. I love you too, baby, you mean more to me than life itself, I said as I ran my fingers down her back. You've been so strong through all of this, I'm proud of you, sweetheart, I said kissing her face. I'm proud of you too, for not backing down and for what you've accomplished so far with the research. If it wasn't for you, it never experiences the things we have, and for that I am grateful. I have a passion for this just like you, but you made it happen, Ashton responded. I put on Scooby-Doo and held her until we fell asleep. I could not fall asleep no matter how hard I tried, my brain is stuck in a pattern of guilt and pointless worry. After 2 hours of tossing and turning, I got up and sat in the chair by the window. I put the local news back on and lit a cigarette. The glow from the moon illuminated the snowfall that had been getting gradually heavier. The night felt eerie, the sound of the house creaking occasionally could be heard over the dull sounds of the news reporter. I sat for half an hour, thinking about what Blanca had said tonight. I had the sudden urge to write, so I turned on my desktop computer and drank some wine as I waited for the screen to load. That brings me to now. A few minutes ago I began to hear a light tapping on my mirror. It only would stop when I looked over at my reflection. When I would go back to writing, the tapping would continue. The snow began pelting the roof and window harder than before. I saved all my work and shut down the computer. I got back into bed next to Ashton. I sat up with my back against the headboard, watching the news while finishing my glass of wine. Every 5 minutes or so the tapping would start again. It did not stop until I had laid down to rest the night.